I always believed I knew every piece of my life, that there was no corner of the house where something could hide that I could not explain. When I married your grandfather, I was a young woman with more dreams than certainties. But in those days it was enough to know he came home every night, that he called me my flower, that he worked hard to keep bread on the table. I did not need much more to believe we were happy. Before I start, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing that my story is reaching different places. The first years were simple, the way good things usually are. I would rise before the sun, prepare the coffee, light the wood stove, and wait for him to get up. There was a way he looked at me that made me think nothing in the world could ever separate us. I learned to recognize the sound of his boots on the porch, the way he coughed when he came home tired, the click of the suitcase latch when he put away papers I never dared ask about. I thought loving was this, trusting another person's silence. At that time, faith had a big place in our lives. The little church was almost an extension of our house. The priest would often come visit, have coffee, ask about the children. He was a man of few words, but eyes that seemed to see right through you. Sometimes, when he looked at me, I felt a discomfort I could not explain, as if he knew something I did not. But I would shake that thought away, because a woman who spends too much time wondering finds things she would rather not. I remember a Sunday afternoon when the priest came to the door carrying a basket of fruit. He said it was a gift of thanks, that he had received an anonymous donation and wanted to share. I thought it was a beautiful gesture. At the time, I believed God always finds a way to gladden those in need. I did not know that behind so many kind acts hid a truth that one day would fall heavy on my head. As the years passed, I began to notice my husband seemed different after confession. He would leave the sacristy with a pale face and lowered eyes. When I asked if something was wrong, he would say no, but his voice never had conviction. I told myself it must be the weight of some old sin, the kind men carry and never confess to a wife. And I accepted that, because it was easier to believe than to admit there might be another reason. Things began to truly change one autumn when the wind was fierce. I remember it as if it were yesterday. I had gone to early Mass, as always. After the service, the priest called me aside and asked that I return to the church alone the next afternoon. I felt my heart jump. I asked if there was some problem with our donations, but he said it was a private matter. I spent the rest of that day with a knot in my throat, wondering what could be so grave. He wanted no witnesses. That night, my husband did not notice my unease. He ate supper in silence, as he always did, and then went out for a walk. I stayed in the kitchen, watching the lamplight flicker on the walls. I thought perhaps he was sick, that maybe the priest meant to prepare me for some bad news. I could never imagine what was coming would be worse than any illness. When the next afternoon came, I walked to the church with weak legs. The wind kicked up dust on the road, and I had to stop twice to calm my chest that seemed ready to betray me. When I stepped inside, I found the priest seated on a pew, his hands folded on his lap. He looked at me with the same serenity he always carried, but that day, there was sadness in his eyes. I sat on the front pew and waited for him to begin. The church was empty, but it felt as though all the walls were listening. The smell of incense mingled with my fear. I felt small, like a girl about to be scolded. When he finally spoke, his voice came low, as though he did not want to hurt. He said that for a long time he had kept the secret out of respect for confession, that it was not his custom to reveal anything entrusted to him, but in this case, he believed I deserved to know. I trembled. I asked if my husband was dying. He shook his head. It was then I understood that what I feared was not illness. It was the truth. When he began to tell me, I felt as though my soul was separating from my body. I heard every word as one hears something they do not want to believe. My husband, the man I thought I knew, had another woman in another town. He had another home, another life. The priest said he had tried to counsel him to confess everything, but he never had the courage, and now he felt it was my right to know. I did not cry, not then. I sat in silence, feeling the cold pew under my hands. I thought of every night I had waited for him to come home. I thought of the stories he had told. I thought of his eyes that so often avoided mine. And I realized that deep down, I had always known. I just had not wanted to accept it. When I left the church, the world looked different. The road home seemed longer. Every step hurt. I did not yet know what I would do with that truth. I only knew that from that day on, nothing would ever be the same. Today, when I look back, I think about how many signs I was given before that day at the church. I say that God always shows us the way, but we must be willing to see it. And for a long time, I chose to keep my eyes closed, perhaps because it was easier that way, or because I was afraid of what I would find if I started asking questions. Everything began slowly, like someone who arrives softly so as not to alarm you. First came the trips he said he had to make because of work that was never very clear. He would leave before dawn, saying he would return by late afternoon, but many times he only came back the next day. I asked if he had eaten, if he had slept well, and he answered everything with a tired voice, as if it were all so normal that I was the one who should not question it. There was one night when he came home with a pale face, hollow eyes, and the smell of another perfume clinging to his shirt. I remember feeling a shiver that crawled up my neck and pulsed there like a warning. But I said nothing. I lowered my head and went to fetch water so he could wash his face. While he was washing, I sat staring at the lamp flame flickering on the wall, thinking that if I started asking questions, I would never know peace again. There was also the way he avoided speaking of the future. When we married, we dreamed of saving enough to buy a little piece of land to call our own. But over time, I noticed he no longer spoke of it. He always said it was better to wait, that it was not the right time. I would say I understood, but every silence of his felt like a no he did not dare to pronounce. Other people noticed as well. Comadre Joaquina, who always paid attention to everything, once commented that my husband had a wary look, like someone who kept a secret. I gave a small smile and said that men were like that, closed, but inside, I knew it was not just his way. It was something I could not name. With time, I started making excuses before anyone could ask. I would say he worked too much, that he was an honorable man who had no time for idle talk. And every time I said it, I felt a weight inside my chest, because, deep down, I did not believe it anymore. I remember one morning when I woke up and found the bed empty, his side cold. I went to the porch and saw the cart was gone. I sat on the wooden bench and waited for the sun to rise, trying to understand why my heart was beating so fast. I told myself he must have left early to handle some matter, but that small voice, deep inside, whispered, it was more than that. When he came back, it was already past midday. I asked where he had been, and he said he had gone to help a neighbor haul firewood, but I saw he could not look me in the eyes. It was then I understood that the trust I had always kept was beginning to unravel. Even so, I did not ask more. I was afraid to hear from his mouth what my heart already knew. There was a time I thought about going to the priest sooner. He had always been a man of good counsel, someone who knew how to listen, but I stopped myself. I said that marriage was something you handled inside your own home, that a greater shame would be to carry our troubles to the church. I feared the opinions of others more than the loneliness growing between us. The nights became long. I would lie down and pretend to sleep before he came in. That way, we did not have to talk. I did not have to feel that heavy silence that stood between us, and little by little, I grew used to his absence. It was as if I lived with a stranger who merely shared my roof. Even so, there were days he came home with a gentle manner, as if wanting to remind me he was still my husband. He would bring a piece of candy wrapped in paper or a new cloth for me to sew. In those moments, my heart would be confused. I would think perhaps I was being unfair, that he was only tired, worried about things I could not understand. And for an instant, I would believe there was still an us. But the next day, everything would start again. And I would go back to being the woman who waited on the porch, who closed her eyes to what hurt, who kept silent because she feared the answer. Today, after everything, I understand that those signs were God preparing me. Every silence, every absence, every small lie was a warning I chose to ignore. Because to love is sometimes also to deceive yourself. We cling to the little we are given and pretend it is enough, until life shows us it was nothing at all. In those days, the priest was almost like part of our household. He would come every week, sometimes twice, bringing news about some collection, asking if we needed help, sitting to have coffee at the wooden table my husband had built with his own hands. I always thought he was a good man, devoted to the calling he had received, and maybe he truly was. But he was also the only one who had the courage to tell me what no one else dared to say. I remember him arriving in his simple cassock, his calm face, and eyes that seemed to see more than we showed. When he walked in, my husband would change. He became too serious, his gaze always wandering, his hands restless. I used to say that was respect, that a man in front of a priest becomes more restrained. But over time, I realized it was not only that. It was as if he carried the fear of being discovered, a worry I, for so long, chose to pretend I did not see. There were times when I would be sewing and could hear the two of them speaking in low voices in the parlor. The priest spoke little, but my husband always seemed agitated. Sometimes he would stand up and pace back and forth, like someone searching for an answer he did not want to give. I tried hard not to listen. I told myself those were matters that did not concern me, that men and priests talked about things a woman did not need to know. But inside, I felt an uneasiness growing. One afternoon, after the priest had left, I asked why he seemed so nervous. My husband looked at me for an instant, and I saw in his eyes a silent plea that I would not insist. He answered that it was only matters of conscience, that sometimes he needed to unburden himself to someone who understood a man's weaknesses. I wanted to believe him. I clung to that answer like someone clings to a plank in the middle of a river. But the doubt had already taken root, and once it settles, it does not leave easily. The priest had the habit of asking how I was. Every time he came, he looked at me with care and said I looked tired, that I should mind my health. I would smile, thank him, say it was only the weight of daily work. But deep down, I felt he wanted to say something else, as if he carried in his hands a truth heavier than any sin. One day he arrived and asked me to sit down. I thought it strange, for I had never seen him so solemn. He held my hand for a moment and said that sometimes we must be strong to hear what we do not wish to. My heart began to race. I asked if it was something bad about my children. He said no, that it was about my husband, and that he could say no more just then, that the time would come for me to know everything. I left there with weak legs. I spent the entire night awake, listening to the wind tapping the window, trying to imagine what he meant. My husband came home late that night, and I pretended to be asleep. I was afraid to look at him and let it slip that I already suspected, because I was not ready to face the truth. I still needed to believe our life had some worth. The priest kept coming, always with the same care in his gestures. Sometimes I felt like begging him to tell me everything, to spare me that waiting that hurt more than any wound. But I had no courage, because part of me still wanted to keep up appearances. Part of me believed that if no one spoke, maybe the problem would vanish. One Sunday morning, after Mass, he called me into the sacristy. He said he prayed for me every day and that God would not let me be left without support. I lowered my head, not knowing how to answer, because inside me grew the certainty that what he was keeping would change my life. I just did not know when he would find the strength to tell me. I know many people think a priest should not meddle in someone's marriage, but if he had not called me, I would have died without knowing who was sleeping by my side. Today, I believe it was God who sent that message, because he knew I would never have had the strength to uncover it on my own. The priest was the only person who saw my pain before it turned into public shame. He was the only one who did not pretend he noticed nothing. And he was the one who, in the end, gave me the courage to accept that not everything we build lasts forever. I will never forget the afternoon when the priest sent for me. The day was overcast, and the wind made the tiles creak. I woke with a tightness in my heart, as if I already knew something was going to happen. I spent the morning in silence, tending to my tasks, but everything seemed out of place. The smell of the coffee, the sound of the pestle, the birds singing. Nothing gave me any comfort. When the sacristan's cart stopped at the gate, I felt my chest go cold. He got down slowly, took off his hat, and said the priest asked that I come to the church that very afternoon. I asked if it was urgent, and he said yes, that it was a matter that could wait no longer. I wanted to ask what it was, but I held my tongue, because deep down, I already had a premonition. It was as though some part of me had spent my whole life preparing for that moment. After he left, I sat on the porch bench. I laid my hands in my lap and stared at the yard. I remembered when I first came to that house, still a young bride, full of hope. I remembered all the times I imagined being a wife meant bearing everything in silence. I wondered whether it would have been different if I had learned to speak sooner. But it was too late. By the time you realize it, your life has already passed. When the time came to go, I washed my face, pinned my hair up in a tight bun, and put on my plainest dress. I wanted to show respect, but also hide my fear. I took my rosary because it seemed the only thing that could steady me. I walked the road on foot. Every step felt heavy as lead. The clouds in the sky seemed to echo my heart, laden with foreboding. The church door was ajar. I slipped in quietly. The smell of burnt candle and incense surrounded me. I saw the priest sitting near the altar with his head bowed. When he saw me, he motioned for me to come closer. I went to him and felt my legs weaken. I placed my hand on the back of a pew to keep from falling. He looked at me with so much sadness that I felt I might cry before I even knew what he was about to say. He asked me to sit down. I obeyed, clutching the rosary as though it were my last hope. The silence that settled between us felt alive, pulsing, pressing against my chest. Then he took a deep breath and said he had called me because he could no longer carry the weight of that secret alone, that he had done all he could to counsel my husband, but that now it was time for me to know. I trembled. My eyes filled with tears, but I did not let them fall. I asked if my husband was ill. The priest shook his head slowly. He said it was not an illness, but in a way, it was also an evil that destroyed lives. I felt sure I could not bear to hear, but he went on, his voice low, as if he feared the walls might hear. He told me that years before, my husband had confessed to having another woman, a woman he visited when he claimed to be traveling for work, that he had a daughter with her, that because of the seal of confession, the priest had never been able to tell me. But now, after so much urging, and my husband's refusal to confess, he believed I deserved to know, that God would not be offended if he broke his silence to spare me more suffering. I could not say anything. It was as if my body had turned to stone. I could only stare at the floor and think of all the times my intuition had tried to warn me. All those nights I felt he was not away only for work. All those mornings when the strange perfume clung to his shirts. Everything made sense at once, like a door thrown wide to reveal a house fully lit. The priest gave me time. He said nothing else. He simply sat there, waiting for me to breathe. I do not know how long it took. I only know that when I finally raised my head, I felt a weariness I had never known. It was as though all the strength I had stored over a lifetime had left me. I asked if anyone else knew. He said no, that my husband had trusted him and that no one had ever suspected. I felt a strange mix of relief and anger. Relief that I was not mad, that there was a reason I had felt what I felt, and anger that I had spent so long silent, believing in a story that had never existed. When I said goodbye to the priest, he took my hand and told me God does not abandon those who are just. I wanted to believe that. But at that moment, it felt as though I was alone in the world. I left the church without looking back. The afternoon was falling, and the cold wind dried the tears I could no longer hold back. Every step home was heavy, as if I were carrying a cross. I did not know what my life would be from that day on. I only knew that after that day, I would never again be the same woman. I walked back home with heavy legs, as if each step was dragging the weight of all the years I had lived without knowing the truth. The cold wind beat against my face and dried my tears, but inside it felt as if I was soaked through with pain. I kept remembering the priest's words and felt a part of me wanting to believe it was all a lie, that he was mistaken, that my husband could never be capable of such betrayal. But another part, deep inside, whispered that I had always known, that I only pretended not to see so I would not lose what little peace I still had. When I reached the gate, I stood there for a long while before going in. The house was silent, and that silence already felt different. It was as if all the walls were watching me, waiting to see what I would do. I laid my hand on the doorknob, drew a deep breath, and forced myself to step inside. I did not know what I would say. I did not even know if I would have the courage to speak, but something inside me told me it was time to stop hiding. I sat down in the kitchen chair, the same one where I had so often waited for him in the middle of the night. My eyes wandered over the table, the pots on the stove, the cloth covering the bread. Everything looked strange, as though I were a guest in my own life. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the day we were married. I remembered the simple dress, the flowers my mother brought from the yard, the way he squeezed my hand when he promised we would be as one. I wanted to ask that young woman I had been where she had gotten lost. At what point along the way she had forgotten she also had worth. The day dragged on. Every minute felt as long as an entire night. When darkness fell, I lit the lamp and sat listening to the sounds of the night outside. I knew he would return, that he would open the door as always, that he would pretend nothing had changed, but I no longer wanted to pretend. It was already late when I heard his steps in the yard. My heart began to race, not from love, but from fear of what was coming. He came in quietly, set his hat on the table, and looked at me. I think he knew at once that something was different, because he did not say a word. He just stood there, as if waiting for my judgment. I asked him to sit down. My voice came out low but steady. He obeyed. We sat a while in silence until I asked whether he had something to tell me. He lowered his eyes and rubbed his face with his hand. He said he did not know where to begin, and in that moment, I saw that the man I had loved no longer existed. What was before me was only an ordinary man, full of weaknesses he had never dared face. He began to speak slowly, as if he had to drag each word up from some deep well. He told me he had met another woman many years before, that at first it had only been a mistake, but later it became a habit. He said he had a daughter, that he had never had the courage to claim. He said he had thought of ending everything, but always lacked the nerve. I listened to it all without interrupting. Inside me, each of his sentences fell like a stone on my chest, but I did not cry. I only wanted him to say everything, so nothing would remain hidden. When he finished, he looked at me as if asking forgiveness without speaking the word. I did not know what to do. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw in his face all the years I had spent waiting for a love that had never been whole, but another part only wanted silence. I told him I knew. I said the priest had called me, that I had already heard everything. I saw the shock in his eyes. I saw the shame. I saw the relief. Because in some way, he too was tired of lying. We sat there a long time, each one bearing their share of the ruin. When he finally stood up, he did not say anything more. He went to the bedroom and closed the door. I stayed in the kitchen, watching the lamp burn low. I thought that was the end of everything I had believed in. But in a strange way, it was also the start of something new. Because the truth, no matter how it wounds, is always a relief after so many lies. I spent that night awake. I did not cry. I did not pray. I only lay there remembering all I had lived. The good days, the laughter, the children, the small gestures that had seemed like love. I did not want to erase my story. I only wanted to understand how we reach a point where nothing is what it appears to be. When dawn came, I felt that part of me had died, but I also discovered that another part was being born. A part that would no longer accept crumbs, that no longer wished to keep quiet. And it was in that silence of dawn that I promised myself I would never again pretend I did not know. The morning after his confession, I woke without knowing whether what I had lived was real or some cruel dream. The house was so quiet it felt uninhabited. The sun came through the crack in the window and lit the wooden floor, and I just sat there on the edge of the bed, without the courage to move. I wondered whether he was still inside, whether he had left in the middle of the night, but I had no strength to go and see. It took me a long time to leave the bedroom. When I finally walked to the kitchen, everything was as it always had been. The kettle on the stove, the bread covered by the embroidered cloth, the empty chair. I thought maybe that was all that remained of our life, things in their place, but love nowhere to be found. I felt a sadness so deep, I thought I would never find joy in anything again. But there was also a strange feeling of peace, as though I had waited my whole life to know that lie. He was sitting outside near the rosebush. He looked like an old man, though he was not. His face was tired, his gaze lost. I wanted to ask if he had slept, but I stayed silent. I passed by him without a word and went to tend to my chores. As I swept the yard, I thought of all the silence I had swallowed in the name of a marriage that existed only for those who looked from the outside. And there, holding the broom, I realized that silence can also be a choice. That day, no one came to visit. It was as if even the neighbors sensed that something had changed in that house. I was grateful for the quiet. I needed time to think about what I would do next, whether I would tell everyone, whether I would pretend nothing had happened, whether I would find the courage to leave. For a long time, I wished someone else would make that decision for me, but I knew no one would. It was mine to make. In the afternoon, I went to the room where he was. I knocked softly on the door, and he answered with a murmur. I stepped in slowly, my heart beating fast. I sat on a chair near the bed and waited for him to say something, but he remained silent, staring at nothing. He looked like a defeated man, and part of me felt pity. Another part wanted to shake him, to scream, to ask how he had dared to lie for so long. But I did none of that. I only said that I needed a few days to understand my feelings. He nodded without raising his eyes. That night, I lay down alone. The bed was too big for my small body. I thought of all the years I had spent trying to please, trying to keep the house in order, as if everything depended on me, and I realized that deep down, I had been afraid of loneliness, afraid to admit that I too was to blame for not wanting to know. And in that silence, I felt I had to forgive myself before I could even think of forgiving him. The following days dragged on. I did everything on automatic. I prepared the meals, fed the chickens, watered the garden. He spoke almost nothing. He spent the morning sitting in the yard, his hands folded, his eyes lost on the road. Sometimes I wondered if he was waiting for me to leave, if he hoped I would make the decision he had never had the courage to make. But I was in no hurry. I wanted to understand what my soul was telling me. One afternoon, while I was sewing, I thought I could tell the neighbors everything, that I could say it aloud, without shame, that I had been deceived. Perhaps then the shame would stop weighing on me. But something in me did not want that. I did not want my story to become something for others to gossip about. I did not want my children to find out in the worst way. I chose silence, not because of fear, but because at that moment it was my only form of dignity. I knew that one day I would have to speak, that my children would need to hear the truth from me. But at that time, I did not yet have the strength, and that was all right. I had the right to wait until I could find my voice. The silence I chose was not cowardice. It was only the space between who I had been and who I was yet to become. When night came, I would sit on the porch, wrapped in my shawl, looking at the sky. I thought perhaps God knew how tired I was, and I asked him not to let me lose my faith, because I felt that if I lost it, nothing else would make sense. And it was in that long silence that I began to learn that truth does not always need to be shouted. Sometimes it only needs to be held, very quietly, until we find the strength to tell it to the world. The days went by, and the truth settled inside me like a stone you learn to carry in the pocket of your apron. At first, I would wake every morning with that start in my chest, as if I needed to remember that I was no longer the same woman. Later, the pain turned into a deep silence. I got up, made the coffee, cared for the house with the same dedication as always, but nothing tasted the same. What hurt me most was realizing he suffered too. I saw it in the way he walked so slowly, in the way he could not look me in the eye. I knew he did not expect forgiveness because he could not forgive himself either. But I also knew that his shame did not lessen my hurt. They were two wounds that would not heal, only glance at each other from a distance. One afternoon, he tried to speak to me. I was sitting on the porch, sewing a piece of cloth I meant to turn into a tablecloth. He came up slowly, stopped in front of me, and said my name with a voice that trembled. I looked up and saw he was shaking. I waited for him to go on, but he could not. He just stood there until he turned around and went back into the house without saying another word. I lowered my head and kept passing the needle through the fabric, because in that moment, I no longer had the strength to hold up any conversation. The hardest part was living with the lie that, even uncovered, still lived between us. Every corner of the house seemed to hold a piece of the story he had never told me. The kitchen bench where he had so often sat, pretending nothing was happening. The bedroom, which at night seemed too large for our absences. Even the rosebush outside, planted in the year we married, looked as though it had become sad. Sometimes, I thought it would be easier if he had left, because being there, he forced me to face what I would rather forget. But every morning, when I woke, he was sitting in the same place, with the same lost stare. And I understood that he was carrying his own burden too. I discovered that truth has a weight no one else can carry for you. Each of us holds our part and tries not to let it fall. I held mine as best I could, reminding myself every day that it was not my fault I had been deceived. I had done all I knew, all I could. If he chose another path, it was not because I was lacking. It was because he himself did not know how to be whole. In those days, I began to write in an old notebook. I wrote down everything I felt, everything that passed through my thoughts. I wrote as one confesses a sin, but also as one frees herself from it. Each word was a way to empty my chest, because I feared that if I kept everything to myself, it would turn into bitterness. And I did not want to become a bitter woman. I wanted to keep being who I had always been, only more aware. Some mornings, I woke thinking of leaving, packing my things, taking the road, starting again, far from everything. But when I looked at my house, at the memories I had planted there, I felt I should not abandon all I had built. I could leave on the inside without going away. I could learn to live another life in the same house. I did not tell anyone. Not my friend Joaquina, who had always been curious, nor the neighbors who came to ask why he had grown so quiet. I said he was tired, that the times were heavy. And they believed it, because everyone has their own burden to carry, and no time to watch too closely the burden of others. What kept me standing was faith. Every night, I prayed, even without knowing whether God was listening. I prayed not to lose hope, not to let my heart harden, because I knew that if it hardened, I would lose everything that made me good, and that I was not willing to allow. I learned that living with truth is harder than living with lies, because lies, at least, give the illusion that everything is fine. The truth does not. The truth lays everything bare, but it also gives a strange peace, because after it arrives, you no longer have to pretend. And so it was, with a heavy heart and a clean conscience, that I kept on with my days, because I knew that even if no one else knew, I carried inside me something priceless, the certainty that I owed nothing to anyone. I cannot say exactly how much time passed between the day the priest told me the truth and the day I finally resolved to speak. It may have been weeks, it may have been months. All I know is that during that time, each day felt like an eternity. I would wake and wonder if that would be the day I would find the courage, but I always left it for later, because to speak was also to confirm everything I most feared. It was on a cold morning that I felt I could not postpone it any longer. I woke before the sun, sat on the edge of the bed, and realized I did not want to carry that secret with me to the end of my life. I thought of my children. I thought of myself. I even thought of him, because in some way, that silence was killing us slowly. I got up and went to prepare the coffee. While the water heated, I watched the flame flicker in the wood stove. I remembered the first time he came into my kitchen, still a young man, full of dreams that later got lost along the way. I remembered the pride I felt when he said he wanted to make me happy, and I thought that despite everything, a part of me still clung to the hope that he might be sincere at least once. When he woke, I was already sitting at the table. He came in slowly, as if he guessed this was not an ordinary day. He stopped in front of me and remained silent. I did not ask him to sit, but he pulled out the chair and stayed there waiting. It was in that moment that I felt my voice coming. It was not a cry, nor a lament. It was a calm I had never felt before, as if at last I knew I did not have to carry anything alone anymore. I told everything. I told him the priest had called me, that I knew about the other woman, the daughter he had hidden. I told him I had spent countless nights without sleep, trying to understand where our life had broken. And I told him my silence had not been forgiveness, it had only been fear. While I spoke, he did not interrupt. He kept his eyes lowered, his hands resting on the table as though he were praying. When I finished, the silence filled the house. It was a long silence, heavy, but also necessary, because in that instant I felt I had nothing left to fear. He raised his head slowly. His eyes were full of tears. He said he was sorry, that he had never had the courage to be a real man, that he thought hiding was the easiest way, and now he knew it had been the most cowardly path. I listened without replying, because after so many lies, no word could bring any comfort. I thought that once I spoke, I would feel lighter. But the truth is that in that moment, I only felt tired. It was as though all the weight I had carried for so many years had finally settled, and I knew I no longer needed to pretend it did not hurt. That same day, I called my children. I sat with them in the parlor and told them the truth, with as much gentleness as I could find. I said I did not want them to grow up thinking love was that, hiding, lying, staying silent. I wanted them to know that even with everything, I had truly loved, that my dignity did not lie in pretending, but in choosing to speak. They listened in silence. Some cried, others stayed solemn, saying nothing. But deep down, I saw that they respected me more for having told them, because the lie we keep alive also grows in the hearts of others, and I no longer wanted that. That night, I went to bed with a heavy heart, but in peace, because a spoken word has a power we only understand when we have the courage to set it free. I did not know what would come after, but I knew that from that day on, everything would be true, even if it hurt. And that was how I began to learn that speaking is not the end. It is only the beginning of a life that no longer depends on pretending. After the truth was spoken, the house did not feel any lighter. I had a foolish hope that by telling it all, everything would somehow find a way to settle inside me. But the silence that came after was different. No longer the silence of lies, but the silence of what could not be fixed. It was as if we had torn down a wall and found nothing on the other side but emptiness. In those first days, he moved through the house like a man who had lost his own voice. He woke early, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the floor. I made the coffee in silence, feeling there was nothing more to say. It was a coexistence without anger, but also without comfort. Because when everything is revealed, all that remains is what each of us truly is, with no excuses left to hide our weaknesses. I thought maybe he would leave, that he would gather his few clothes and go without looking back. But he stayed, and that staying hurt too, because it was proof there was no escape that could erase what had happened. Sometimes I wanted to ask why he did not go, whether it was out of cowardice or some leftover affection. But I did not ask. We had already said everything. My children, after that day, looked at me with a new respect. They no longer saw me as the woman who only knew how to stay silent. I could tell they felt shame on my behalf, but they also felt pride, because they knew that telling the truth came at a high price. I wondered many times whether I had done the right thing, whether it would have been better to keep everything to myself until the end, so no one would carry resentment. But I always came back to the same answer. A lie weighs even more when you pretend it does not exist. One afternoon, he sat across from me and asked whether I could ever forgive him. His voice came out so low it was almost a whisper. I looked into his eyes and saw that he too had become another man, a man who did not know who he was without the lie he had told for so long. I said I did not know how to answer, that perhaps forgiveness was not something you gave all at once, but something that might grow slowly, or perhaps never grow at all. He lowered his head and said nothing more. Time passed, as it always does. The days went on full of routine, washing clothes, tending the yard, sweeping the porch. Sometimes I woke thinking all of it had been just a bad dream, but all it took was to look at him, sitting there with his weary face, to remember that it was all true. I learned to live in that in-between, neither married as before, nor truly separated, just sharing the same space with what dignity I had left. I discovered there is no formula for what to do after trust breaks. Each woman finds her own way to go on. Mine was to stay, not because I had forgiven everything, but because I did not want to start again carrying shame. I wanted to learn to stand without shrinking. On some nights when I could not sleep, I thought that despite everything, there was a new freedom inside me, because finally, I no longer had to pretend. I could be a whole woman, even with all my wounds showing. And that, in some way, was strength. I cannot say if I ever truly forgave, but I learned that life does not wait for us to heal before it goes on. It keeps moving, and we keep walking with it, our scars exposed to the wind. It was during that time I discovered the worth of spoken words and the courage that is born when we decide we will no longer lie, not even to ourselves. And that was how, even in the pain, I began to feel alive again. Now that time has passed and the pains have quieted at the bottom of my memory, I think about what I would say if I could sit with you, my daughter, and tell you everything with the calm that life teaches us. I think that no woman should have to learn this way, carrying alone a weight she did not sow, but I know many do. That is why I chose not to stay silent anymore, because perhaps if someone had told me what I will tell you now, I would have been less hard on myself. If I could leave you one piece of advice, it would be this. Never accept less than respect. Love may fade, the enchantment may be lost, but respect is what sustains everything when the rest fails. I accepted crumbs out of fear of being alone. I accepted excuses I knew were false because I preferred the pain I knew over the emptiness of having nothing at all. Today, I know that nothing hurts more than remaining in a place where you are not whole. I know the world will try to tell you that a good woman is the one who endures everything, that the most beautiful is the one who smiles even when it hurts. but do not believe that. The most beautiful smile is the one of a woman who owes nothing to anyone, the one who can lay her head on the pillow knowing she did not betray herself. If one day your heart warns you that something is wrong, listen. Do not do as I did, silencing your intuition for fear of scandal, because there is no scandal greater than a life lived in lies, and there is no shame in wanting to know the truth. I wish I could tell you that after everything, I became a better woman. But the truth is that I only became a clearer woman. I learned that to love is not to lose yourself, that faithfulness is not a favor, it is a commitment, and that someone who does not know how to be whole does not deserve even half of you. If I could, I would give you the courage I lacked. I would lend you the words I never spoke, the questions I never asked, but I know each woman finds her own hour. Mine came late, but it came. And when it did, I understood that it is never too late to stop lying to yourself. I want you, when you think of me, not to feel pity. I want you to feel respect, because despite everything, I was loyal until the last day. And when I could no longer stay silent, I spoke. That was all I could give. If one day you have to choose between the silence that suffocates and the truth that frees, choose the truth, even if it hurts, even if it seems there will be nothing left after. Because what remains, my daughter, is always what matters most. What stays after the storm is what we carry to the end. And if you wish to know what was left of me after everything, I will tell you. What remained was the woman who never stopped believing she deserved more. What remained was the certainty that my worth did not depend on anyone but myself. So keep this advice as you would a gift. Never be afraid to lose someone who is not afraid to lose you. And never think your silence will save what is already lost. Your silence will only steal you from yourself. And so it was, with empty hands and a heart fuller than ever, that I understood life is made of choices, and the most beautiful of all is choosing never to live small. If you liked Grandma's story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can hear more stories like this and share them with other people who might be inspired by this story of overcoming. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been in a similar situation? How did you react? A kiss on the heart from all of you. And until the next story.